My flight attendant slipped me a napkin that said, "Pretend you're sick. Get off this plane." I thought it was some kind of joke and ignored her. Minutes later, she returned, pale and shaking. "Please," she whispered, "I'm begging you." I looked around. Everyone seemed calm. Still, something in her eyes froze me. 2 hours later, I finally understood why she was terrified. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Clifford, and at 64 years old, I thought I knew everything there was to know about my life. I was wrong. It started on Flight 743 from Denver to Chicago. I had just finished a 3-day business conference, the kind where old men like me pretend we still understand the modern world, while younger executives smile politely and wait for us to retire. My knees ached from the cramped economy seat, and all I wanted was to get home to Margaret and our son David. The flight attendant looked young enough to be my granddaughter, with auburn hair pulled back in a neat bun and nervous eyes that kept darting around the cabin. When she handed me my ginger ale, her fingers trembled slightly as she slipped a folded napkin under the plastic cup. I barely glanced at it until she walked away. Then I unfolded the napkin and felt my blood run cold. "Pretend you're sick. Get off this plane." I looked around the cabin. Business travelers typed on laptops, a mother fed her baby, an elderly couple shared a crossword puzzle. Everything seemed perfectly normal. I studied the napkin again, wondering if this was some kind of prank or if the young woman had mental health issues. 20 minutes later, she returned to collect my empty cup. Her face was even paler now, and I noticed her hands shaking as she reached for the trash. "Excuse me," I whispered, leaning forward. "Did you write this?" She glanced at the napkin, then at me, and I saw genuine terror in her eyes. "Please," she whispered back, so quietly I had to strain to hear her over the engine noise. "I'm begging you. Tell them you feel chest pains or something. Get off at the next stop." "Young lady, I don't understand what—" "Please." Her voice broke slightly. "I can't explain right now, but you're in danger. More danger than you know." I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't a prank. This girl was genuinely frightened, and somehow it had to do with me. But that made no sense. I was nobody special, just a retired mid-level manager who had spent 40 years pushing papers and attending meetings. "How do you know me?" I asked. She looked over her shoulder, checking if anyone was watching, then leaned closer. "My name is Sarah Morrison. Does that mean anything to you?" Morrison. The name hit me like a physical blow. Janet Morrison had been my secretary for 15 years, from 1985 to 2000. A dedicated, hard-working woman who knew more about my department than I did. She had been let go during a company restructuring, and I had always felt guilty about not fighting harder to keep her. "Janet Morrison's daughter?" Sarah nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "She's on this plane too, in first class. She's been sick and I've been taking care of her, but when she saw your name on the passenger manifest—" Sarah paused, taking a shaky breath. "Mr. Hendricks, my mother has been carrying a secret for 24 years. A secret about your family that could destroy everything you believe about your life." My heart started pounding. What kind of secret? "I can't tell you here. Too many people might overhear. But she has documents, Mr. Hendricks. Papers that prove your wife and son have been lying to you for decades. Papers that show what really happened to all those employees who were fired, all those contracts that went wrong, all those decisions that ruined people's lives." I felt like the cabin was spinning around me. Margaret and David? Impossible. They were my anchors, my reason for working so hard all those years. David was a successful businessman now, running his own consulting firm. Margaret had been the perfect corporate wife, supporting my career every step of the way. "You're mistaken," I said firmly. "My family would never—" "Mr. Hendricks," Sarah interrupted, her voice urgent. "My mother kept copies of everything, every forged signature, every altered contract, every fake authorization. She kept them because she knew someday the truth would need to come out." She glanced around again, then looked back at me with desperate eyes. "They used you as a front for 20 years. You signed documents you never read, approved contracts you never saw, authorized decisions you never made, and when things went wrong, when people got hurt, your name was on everything. The oxygen seemed to be draining from the cabin. I gripped the armrests of my seat, trying to process what she was telling me. All those years of working late, all those times Margaret would bring me papers to sign at home while I was watching television or reading the newspaper. "Just some routine forms, honey," she would say. "Don't worry about the details." "That's impossible," I whispered, but even as I said it, memories were surfacing. The night Janet Morrison was fired, I remembered coming home to find Margaret and David having an intense conversation that stopped the moment I walked in. David had been 28 then, fresh out of business school and working as my assistant at the company. "Mr. Hendricks, they've been planning something big, something that's going to happen when you land in Chicago. My mother overheard them talking at the hospital yesterday. She was getting her chemotherapy treatment, and they didn't know she was there." "Hospital? What hospital?" "Northwestern Memorial." They were in the waiting area, and my mother recognized their voices from the times they called the office. She heard them talking about finalizing everything and making sure the old man never finds out. My mouth went dry. Northwestern Memorial was where David had told me he was taking Margaret for her routine checkup yesterday. But if they were there, and Janet overheard them. "What exactly did your mother hear?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "They were talking about having you declared mentally incompetent. Something about medical records being altered to show early dementia. They said once you're committed, they'll have power of attorney over everything." The cabin felt like it was closing in on me. I thought about the strange appointments David had been scheduling for me lately. "Memory assessments," he called them. "Just routine stuff for someone your age, Dad. Nothing to worry about." I looked at Sarah's terrified face and realized that this young woman was risking her job, maybe even her safety, to warn me. "Why are you telling me this? Why should I trust you?" "Because my mother never forgot what a kind man you were to her. Even when she was fired, you fought for her severance package. You made sure she got good references. She said you were the only honest person in that whole company." Sarah's voice cracked. "And because what they did to her, they're about to do to you. They're going to destroy your life and walk away clean." The plane hit turbulence, and I felt my stomach lurch. But it wasn't just the air pockets making me sick. It was the growing realization that everything I thought I knew about my life might be built on lies. "If what you're saying is true," I said slowly, "then I've been living with strangers for 40 years. Sarah nodded sadly. "My mother said she tried to warn you once, about 6 months before she was fired. She left a note in your desk drawer with some of the evidence. Do you remember that?" I did remember, a manila envelope with photocopied documents that made no sense to me at the time. When I asked Margaret about it, she had laughed and said it was probably someone trying to cause trouble. "Disgruntled employees will say anything," she had told me. "Don't let paranoid people poison your mind against your own family." I had thrown the envelope away without looking at it again. Now, sitting in that airplane seat with my hands trembling and my heart racing, I realized that Margaret's quick dismissal hadn't been protection. It had been manipulation, and I had been too trusting, too naive, too comfortable in my bubble of domestic happiness to see it. The plane began its descent toward Chicago, and I looked at Sarah's frightened face one more time. She was risking everything to save a man she barely knew because her mother had remembered one act of kindness from decades ago. "What do you want me to do?" I asked quietly. Relief flooded her features. "When we land, don't go home. Don't call them. Meet my mother at the coffee shop in Terminal 3. She'll be waiting with the documents. Everything you need to know is in those files." As the wheels touched down on the runway, I realized my old life was about to end. Whether that was a tragedy or a blessing, I was about to find out. I found Janet Morrison sitting in the corner of the airport coffee shop, looking nothing like the vibrant woman who used to manage my chaotic schedule with military precision. 24 years had aged her dramatically, and the chemotherapy had taken its toll. Her once thick brown hair was now thin and gray, hidden under a colorful scarf, but her eyes, those sharp, intelligent eyes that never missed a detail, were exactly the same. "Mr. Hendricks," she said softly as I approached her table. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "Janet." I sat down across from her, noting the thick manila folder beside her coffee cup. "Sarah said you have something important to show me." She nodded, her hands wrapped around her mug as if drawing warmth from it. "I've been carrying this burden for 24 years. I kept telling myself it wasn't my place to interfere in your family life, that maybe I was wrong about what I saw. But when Sarah told me about the conversation she overheard at the hospital," Janet's voice trailed off and she shook her head, "I couldn't stay silent anymore." "What exactly did you see, Janet?" She opened the folder and pulled out a photograph. It showed Margaret and David sitting in what looked like a restaurant, their heads close together over some papers. The timestamp showed it was taken in 1999. I was having dinner with my sister that night when I saw them. They didn't see me, but I watched them for over an hour. They had contracts spread across the table, and your son was showing your wife where to forge your signature. My stomach dropped. "Forge my signature?" "I took this picture because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Look at this." She pulled out a magnifying glass and pointed to the papers in the photo. "You can actually see one of the Hartley construction contracts, the same contract that ended up bankrupting 3 families when the project was canceled." I remembered the Hartley situation. It had been a nightmare. A residential development that had been approved, then suddenly terminated due to irregular documentation. The contractor had sued the company, employees had been laid off, and several families had lost their homes when the work dried up. I had signed the cancellation order, or at least I thought I had. "I don't understand. Why would they want to cancel a profitable contract?" Janet pulled out more documents. "Because they had already arranged for the project to be transferred to a different company, a company that David owned through a shell corporation. They killed the Hartley deal so they could pick up the pieces at a fraction of the cost." She spread several papers across the table. Bank statements, incorporation documents, property transfers, the side evidence was overwhelming. David had created a network of fake companies, all designed to profit from the chaos created by his sabotage of legitimate contracts. And Margaret knew about all of this? She was the architect of it. Janet's voice was bitter. "Your son may have had the business education, but your wife had the cunning. She knew exactly how to manipulate you without making you suspicious." Janet pulled out a thick stack of contracts. "Do you remember signing these?" I looked at the papers. My signature was on every page, but I had no memory of ever seeing these documents. The dates ranged from 1987 to 2000, spanning my entire tenure as department manager. I remember signing a lot of papers over the years, but these specific ones, I shook my head. Margaret used to bring me documents to sign at home sometimes. She said they were routine forms that couldn't wait until morning. "They weren't routine, Mr. Hendricks. These contracts terminated pension plans, canceled insurance policies, and diverted company funds into accounts that David controlled. Every time you signed one of these, dozens of employees lost benefits they had earned over decades of loyal service." The coffee shop suddenly felt too warm. I loosened my tie, struggling to breathe. "Are you telling me that I destroyed people's lives without knowing it?" "You were used, Mr. Hendricks. Systematically and deliberately used." Janet's voice was gentle but firm. "Look at this one." She showed me a contract dated December 15, 1993. This document canceled the Christmas bonuses for the entire maintenance staff. Do you remember signing this? I did remember that December. Margaret had been excited about planning an expensive vacation to Europe. She had said David needed the trip to recover from stress at work. When I expressed concern about the cost, she told me not to worry because my Christmas bonus would be bigger than usual that year. The maintenance staff never got their bonuses, but your family got a $50,000 consulting fee from a company that David had created the week before. $50,000. In 1993, that was enough to buy a house. I remembered that vacation to Europe vividly. Margaret had been so happy and David had seemed more relaxed than I had seen him in months. I had felt proud that my hard work was finally paying off enough to give my family such a wonderful experience. Janet, how did you find out about all this? I was your secretary for 15 years, Mr. Hendricks. I knew your handwriting, your signature patterns, your habits. When documents started coming through with your signature that didn't match your usual style, I got suspicious, so I started making copies. She pulled out another stack of papers. These are photocopies of every forged signature, every altered contract, every fake authorization that crossed my desk. I kept them in a safety deposit box, thinking that someday I might need them to protect myself if anyone ever questioned my role in what was happening. Why didn't you come to me sooner? Janet's expression grew sad. I tried, Mr. Hendricks. Remember the envelope I left in your desk drawer in 1999? Yes, but Margaret got to you before you could really examine the evidence, and after that I could see that she was watching me more carefully. Then, 6 months later, I was fired for poor performance, despite 15 years of exemplary reviews. I felt sick. Janet, I'm so sorry. I should have looked at that envelope more carefully. I should have trusted you instead of trusting your wife. Janet's smile was bitter. Mr. Hendricks, you're a good man who believed in the goodness of the people you loved. That's not a character flaw, that's what made you vulnerable to their manipulation. She pulled out a final document. This is your termination paperwork from 2000. Do you remember signing this? I looked at the paper. It was my resignation letter, dated a week after Janet was fired. But I had never resigned. I had retired 3 years later with full benefits and a pension. I never signed this. No, you didn't. But they had it ready just in case you started asking too many questions about my firing. If you had pushed the issue, they would have produced this letter and claimed you had suffered a mental breakdown and couldn't remember resigning. The pieces were falling into place now. They've been planning to discredit me for over 20 years. And now they're finally ready to execute the plan. Sarah heard them talking about having you declared incompetent. Once they have legal control over your assets, they can cover up all of this evidence. The companies David created will be dissolved. The stolen money will be laundered through legitimate investments, and you'll spend your final years in a care facility believing you're suffering from dementia. I stared at the mountain of evidence spread across the coffee shop table. 24 years of systematic fraud, theft, and manipulation, and I had been the unwitting face of it all. How much money are we talking about, Janet? She pulled out a calculator and a notebook filled with figures. Based on what I could track, conservatively, at least $2.3 million over the years. But that's just the direct theft. If you calculate the pension funds that were diverted, the insurance policies that were canceled, the contracts that were sabotaged, we're probably looking at close to $8 million in total damages. $8 million. Enough to destroy dozens of families, enough to ruin the retirements of hundreds of loyal employees, and it had all been done in my name with my forged signature while I sat at home watching television and trusting my family to handle the details. Mr. Hendricks, Janet said quietly, there's something else. Something Sarah couldn't tell you on the plane because she didn't want to scare you even more. I looked up from the papers. What? They're planning to kill you. The words hit me like a physical blow. What did you say? At the hospital yesterday, Margaret and David weren't just talking about having you declared incompetent. They were discussing your medical care, something about adjusting your medications to accelerate the natural aging process. David has been researching drugs that can cause heart attacks in elderly patients. I felt my hands start to shake. You're saying they want to murder me? I'm saying they've moved beyond fraud and manipulation. You're the only person who could expose them if you ever learned the truth. As long as you're alive, you're a threat to their security, but if you die of natural causes after being declared mentally incompetent, Janet's voice trailed off. They inherit everything and no one questions the past. Exactly. I sat back in my chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I was learning. My wife of 42 years and my only child had spent decades stealing from innocent people, destroying lives, and now they were planning to kill me to cover it all up. Janet, what am I supposed to do with all this? Who's going to believe that I didn't know what was happening? She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Mr. Hendricks, you're going to fight back, but first you're going to disappear. Janet's words echoed in my mind as I sat in the rental car outside my own house 3 hours later. Disappear. The idea seemed impossible. This was my home, my life, my family. Even knowing what I now knew, the thought of walking away from everything felt like jumping off a cliff. But as I looked at the familiar white colonial where I had lived for 38 years, I realized it had never really been my home. It had been their stage, and I had been nothing more than a prop in their elaborate performance. I had spent those 3 hours with Janet and Sarah, going through every document, every piece of evidence, every detail of the conspiracy that had defined my adult life. Janet had been thorough in her record-keeping. She had bank statements showing money flowing from my department's accounts into shell companies. She had correspondence between Margaret and David discussing which contracts to sabotage next. She had even recorded phone conversations from her home phone when they would call to coordinate their schemes. The most damning evidence was a series of emails Janet had printed from David's computer during her final week at the company. In them, David discussed me with cold detachment, referring to me as the old man and our useful idiot. One email to Margaret was particularly brutal. Dad signed the Morrison termination papers without even reading them. I swear we could get him to sign his own death warrant if we put it in front of him during the evening news. Now, sitting in that rental car with copies of all the evidence in a briefcase beside me, I felt something I had never experienced before. Pure, undiluted rage. Not the momentary anger that comes and goes, but a deep, burning fury that seemed to consume everything else. I walked up the familiar stone pathway, past Margaret's prize-winning rose garden, past the mailbox with our family name painted in elegant script. The key turned in the lock just as it had thousands of times before, but everything felt different now. "Clifford," Margaret's voice came from the kitchen. "You're home early. How was your flight?" I found her at the kitchen island, preparing what looked like my favorite dinner, pot roast with potatoes and carrots. She was wearing the blue dress I had bought her for our anniversary last year, and her silver hair was styled the way I had always liked it. She looked like the perfect wife, the loving partner who had stood by me through 42 years of marriage. "Margaret, we need to talk." She looked up from the carrots she was chopping, and I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Not concern, not curiosity, but calculation. "Of course, darling. Let me just finish getting dinner ready. David is coming over tonight to discuss those medical appointments we scheduled for you. Dr. Peterson wants to run some more tests." Dr. Peterson. The neurologist, David, had insisted I see for routine memory screenings. Now I understood what those appointments were really about. I said, "We need to talk now, Margaret." Something in my tone made her set down the knife. She turned to face me fully, and I saw her expression shift. The loving wife mask slipped just slightly, revealing something harder underneath. "What's this about, Clifford?" I set the briefcase on the kitchen counter and opened it. "It's about Janet Morrison." Margaret's face went completely still. "Janet Morrison was fired 24 years ago. Why are you bringing up ancient history?" "Because ancient history has a way of catching up with you." I pulled out the photograph of her and David at the restaurant. "Especially when there's evidence." Margaret looked at the photo for a long moment, then back at me. When she spoke, her voice was completely different. The warm, nurturing tone I had known for decades was gone, replaced by something cold and sharp. So the old secretary finally grew a backbone. I always wondered when she might surface again. The casual way she said it, the complete lack of surprise or denial, hit me harder than any confession could have. She wasn't even going to pretend. "You knew this day might come." "I hoped it wouldn't." Margaret moved to the kitchen window, looking out at the backyard where we had hosted so many family barbecues over the years. "You were always so trusting, Clifford. so willing to believe the best in people. It made everything so much easier. Everything meaning stealing millions of dollars from innocent people. She turned back to me, and I saw something in her face that made my blood run cold. Not guilt, not remorse, but annoyance, as if I were being unreasonably difficult about a minor household issue. Those people were expendable, Clifford. Maintenance workers, clerks, low-level employees who would have been laid off eventually anyway. We simply accelerated the process and made sure the resources went where they could do more good. More good for who? For us? For David's future? For the life we deserved after all those years of your mediocre salary and limited ambitions? The words hit me like physical blows. My mediocre salary, my limited ambitions. Margaret, I worked 60-hour weeks to provide for this family. I gave you everything I had. She laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass. You gave us a middle-class existence in a middle management position with a middle-tier company. Do you know what it was like being married to someone so aggressively ordinary? Do you know how embarrassing it was to attend company parties and watch other wives show off their husbands' achievements while I had to smile and pretend that being married to a glorified paper pusher was enough? I stared at her, seeing a stranger where my wife had been moments before. So you decided to steal. I decided to take what we should have had if you had possessed any real ambition or talent. Margaret's voice was getting sharper, more venomous. David was brilliant even as a child. He deserved better than growing up as the son of a nobody, so we gave him better. By destroying other people's lives. By taking advantage of opportunities that presented themselves. You were in a position of authority, but you were too weak to use it, so we used it for you. The kitchen door opened, and David walked in. He was still in his business suit, looking successful and confident, just as he always did. When he saw the briefcase and the papers spread across the counter, he stopped mid-step. "Well," he said after a moment, "I guess the cat's out of the bag." His casual tone, the complete lack of surprise, made it clear that this wasn't an unexpected crisis. This was a scenario they had prepared for. "Hello, son." I kept my voice steady, though my heart was pounding. "I've been learning some interesting things about our family business." David walked over to stand beside his mother, presenting a united front. "How much do you know?" "I know that you've been forging my signature for over 20 years. I know that you've stolen at least $2.3 million from employee pension funds and insurance policies. I know that you've destroyed the lives of dozens of families, all while using me as your front man." David nodded, thoughtfully, as if we were discussing the weather. "That's fairly accurate, though your figure is a bit low. We're actually closer to 3.7 million if you count the compound interest on our investments." The casual way he said it, the pride in his voice, made me feel sick. "David, these were people we worked with, people who trusted us. People who were expendable." David's voice was cold, clinical. "Dad, you always had this sentimental attachment to the little people. It was one of your weaknesses. Mom and I saw the bigger picture. The bigger picture being stealing from your coworkers. The bigger picture being securing our family's future despite your limitations." David loosened his tie and sat down at the kitchen table as if this were a casual family discussion. "Do you know what it was like growing up as your son? Watching my friends' fathers buy new cars and take vacations while we lived in this modest little house and counted pennies? We were never poor, David. We had everything we needed. We had everything you thought we needed. But I wanted more. I deserved more. And when I figured out how to get it, Mom was smart enough to help me." Margaret moved to stand behind David's chair, her hand on his shoulder in a gesture of maternal support. "David has built a very successful consulting business, Clifford. He's respected in his field, well-connected, financially secure, everything we could have hoped for in a son. Built on stolen money and destroyed lives. Built on intelligence and opportunity." David's voice was getting impatient. "Dad, you were never going to amount to anything significant. You didn't have the vision or the courage to take real risks, so we took them for you." I looked back and forth between them, still struggling to process the complete transformation of the people I thought I knew. "And now you're planning to have me declared mentally incompetent so you can cover all this up." Margaret and David exchanged a look, and I saw something pass between them. A silent communication that spoke of years of conspiracy. "The incompetency proceedings are for your own good, Clifford." Margaret's voice took on a tone of false concern. "You've been showing signs of confusion lately. Forgetting appointments, misplacing things, having trouble following conversations. Dr. Peterson is concerned about early-stage dementia." "There's nothing wrong with my memory." "Isn't there?" David pulled out his phone and showed me a series of text messages. "These are messages you sent me over the past month. Look at the timestamps and the content." I looked at the messages and my heart sank. They were incoherent, rambling texts sent at odd hours, discussing conversations that had never happened and making references that made no sense. But I had never sent these messages. I didn't write these. The phone company logs say otherwise. David's smile was cold. "We've been building a comprehensive case for months, Dad. Medical records showing cognitive decline, behavioral incidents witnessed by multiple people, financial irregularities that suggest poor judgment and possible exploitation by outsiders." "What financial irregularities?" Margaret opened a folder on the counter. "Large cash withdrawals from your checking account, unusual investment decisions, donations to questionable charities, all documented, all pointing to a man whose mental faculties are deteriorating rapidly." I realized they had been planning this for far longer than Janet had suspected. They hadn't just been stealing from my company. They had been systematically building a case to discredit me personally. "Of course," David continued, "if you were to suffer a sudden medical crisis before the competency hearing, it would save everyone a lot of trouble. Heart attacks are very common in men your age, especially those under stress." The threat was clear, and the casual way he delivered it made my blood run cold. These weren't the people who had loved and supported me for decades. These were strangers who had been wearing masks for so long that the masks had become their true faces. "So what happens now?" I asked. Margaret and David looked at each other again, and I saw David give an almost imperceptible nod. "Now," Margaret said, "you're going to sign some papers that will make everything much simpler for everyone involved." David opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick legal document. "This transfers power of attorney to Mom and me, effective immediately. It also includes a confession of your involvement in various financial irregularities at your former company and an agreement to voluntary commitment for psychiatric treatment. And if I refuse, then you'll have a heart attack sometime in the next 24 hours. David's voice was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the grocery list. "We've done our research, Dad. The right combination of medications can trigger cardiac events that are virtually undetectable in autopsy, especially in a man your age with a history of stress and recent behavioral changes." I stared at them both, finally understanding the full scope of what I was dealing with. These weren't people who had made bad choices or gotten in over their heads. These were predators who had been systematically destroying lives for decades, and I had been their primary weapon. But I wasn't the same man who had walked into this house an hour ago. That man had been naive, trusting, and blind to the evil in his own home. This man was armed with knowledge, evidence, and a burning desire for justice. "I need to think about this," I said slowly. "You have until tomorrow morning," Margaret said. "After that, we'll have to proceed with the alternative plan." I nodded and picked up my briefcase. "I'm going to take a drive, clear my head." "Don't go too far, Clifford." David's voice carried a clear warning. "We'll be keeping an eye on you." As I walked out of that house for what I knew would be the last time, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. Complete clarity about what I needed to do. I drove aimlessly for 2 hours before I could think clearly enough to make a plan. The suburban streets I had traveled for decades looked different now, like I was seeing them through someone else's eyes. Every familiar landmark reminded me of a life that had been built on lies. I ended up at a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where truckers and night shift workers grab coffee and pie at 3 in the morning. It was nearly empty at 8:30 on a weeknight, which was exactly what I needed. I chose a corner booth and ordered coffee I didn't want, trying to process everything that had happened in the past 6 hours. My phone buzzed with a text message from Margaret. "Where are you? Dinner is getting cold." I stared at the message, marveling at her ability to maintain the charade even now, as if we were still a normal family having a minor disagreement instead of predators and prey locked in a deadly game. I turned off my phone and pulled out the business card Janet had given me before I left the airport. Detective Patricia Chen, Financial Crimes Division, Chicago Police Department. Janet had contacted her 3 months ago when she first learned about Margaret and David's plan to have me declared incompetent. The call went through after 2 rings. "Detective Chen. My name is Clifford Hendricks. Janet Morrison gave me your number." There was a pause. "Mr. Hendricks, I've been expecting your call. Where are you right now?" "A diner on Route 41, away from my house." "Good. Stay there. I'm sending 2 officers to bring you to the station. Whatever you do, don't go home tonight." "Detective, I need to know something. How long have you been investigating this?" Another pause. "Mr. Hendricks, we've been building a case against your family for 8 months. You're not the only victim, and the crimes go far beyond what Mrs. Morrison initially reported." 30 minutes later, I was sitting in an interview room at the police station, looking at files that made Janet's evidence seem like the tip of an iceberg. Detective Chen was a small, intense woman in her 40s who spoke with the precision of someone who had spent years building complex cases against white-collar criminals. "Mr. Hendricks, what I'm about to show you is going to be difficult to see, but you need to understand the full scope of what your family has been doing." She opened a thick folder and spread out financial documents. "Your son's consulting business is a front for a much larger operation. He's been using the money stolen from your company to fund investment schemes that target elderly clients specifically." "What kind of schemes?" "Fake retirement communities, non-existent medical research projects, fraudulent insurance policies. Over the past 5 years, David has stolen approximately $12 million from senior citizens who trusted him with their life savings." $12 million. The number was so large I couldn't grasp it. "How many victims?" 67 that we've identified so far, probably more, that we haven't found yet. Detective Chen pulled out a list of names. "These are people who lost their homes, their retirement funds, their children's inheritances. 3 of them committed suicide when they realized they had been wiped out." I stared at the list, my hands shaking. These weren't faceless statistics. These were real people whose lives had been destroyed by my son's greed, and it had all started with the money he had stolen using my forged signature. "What about Margaret? What's her role in all this?" Detective Chen opened another file. "Your wife has been running a parallel operation targeting the spouses of David's victims. When the men lost their money to David's fake investments, Margaret would approach the wives with opportunities to recover their losses: fake legal settlements, non-existent government compensation programs, bogus class action lawsuits. She stole from people who had already been victimized by David. Systematically and deliberately, she would present herself as a financial consultant helping fraud victims, then steal whatever money they had left." Detective Chen's voice was grim. "In some cases, she convinced widows to take out second mortgages on their homes to invest in her fake recovery programs." I felt sick. "How much did she steal?" "Approximately $4 million that we can trace, but Margaret was careful to target women who were unlikely to report the crimes quickly: elderly widows, women with dementia, isolated seniors who didn't have family members monitoring their finances." Detective Chen pulled out another stack of documents. "Mr. Hendricks, your family has been operating one of the most sophisticated elder fraud rings we've ever investigated, and you were the perfect front man because your reputation was spotless. People trusted you, which made them trust your family. But I never knew any of this was happening." "We believe you. Mrs. Morrison's evidence clearly shows that you were manipulated and used without your knowledge, but that's also what made the scheme so effective. Your genuine confusion and distress when things went wrong convinced everyone that you weren't involved." I thought about all the times over the years when former colleagues had approached me at social events, thanking me for my help with some financial matter I didn't remember. I had always assumed I was having senior moments, forgetting routine business transactions. Now I realized those people had been thanking me for investments and opportunities that Margaret and David had offered while using my name and reputation. Detective, how did you first learn about this? One of David's victims was a retired police captain named Frank Mueller. When he lost his pension to one of your son's fake investment schemes, he didn't just file a report. He started his own investigation. Detective Chen pulled out a photograph of an elderly man with sharp eyes and gray hair. Captain Mueller spent 6 months tracking down other victims and building connections between the various schemes. That's how we discovered the link between David's consulting business and your old company. Is Captain Mueller willing to testify? Detective Chen's expression grew sad. Captain Mueller died 4 months ago, heart attack. But before he died, he gave us everything he had collected. 8 boxes of evidence, witness statements, financial records. His final report specifically mentioned you as an unwitting accomplice and recommended that we investigate whether you were also being targeted for fraud. Another life destroyed by my family's greed. What happened to his family? His wife lost their house. She's living with her daughter now, working part-time at a grocery store to help pay the bills. She's 73 years old. Detective Chen closed the file. Mr. Hendricks, Captain Mueller's investigation probably saved your life. If he hadn't connected the dots, we wouldn't have known to warn Mrs. Morrison when we learned about the plan to have you declared incompetent. What plan? I know they want to control my assets, but what exactly were they going to do? Detective Chen opened her laptop and showed me a series of emails. We've been monitoring your family's communications for the past 3 months. These emails discuss the timeline for having you committed to a psychiatric facility where they had arranged for you to receive experimental treatments for your supposed dementia. I read the emails, my horror growing with each message. They weren't just planning to steal my money. They were planning to destroy my mind with drugs and electroshock therapy to ensure I could never testify against them. The facility they chose specializes in patients with severe cognitive impairment. Once you were admitted, it would have been virtually impossible for you to communicate with the outside world or challenge their control over your affairs. And if the psychiatric approach didn't work, the emails suggest they were prepared to accelerate your natural decline through medication manipulation. Your son has been researching drugs that can cause strokes and heart attacks in elderly patients. I set the laptop aside, overwhelmed by the scope of their evil. Detective, I need to know something. How long do you think they've been planning to get rid of me? Detective Chen consulted her notes. Based on the evidence we've collected, we believe the plan started taking shape about 2 years ago, when your son's fraud schemes began attracting attention from other law enforcement agencies. You were becoming a liability because your presence made it harder for them to disappear or claim ignorance if they were caught. So they were going to make me disappear instead. Essentially, yes. With you declared incompetent or dead, they could liquidate your assets, close down the fraudulent businesses, and relocate to a country without extradition treaties. Detective Chen showed me another document. We found evidence that they were planning to move to Costa Rica within the next 6 months. David has already purchased property there under an assumed name. I stared at the property deed, seeing my son's signature on a document that represented his plan to escape justice and live comfortably on the money stolen from dozens of victims. What happens now? Now we finish building our case and prepare for arrests. But Mr. Hendricks, we need your help. You're the key witness who can tie all the pieces together. Without your testimony about the forged signatures and the manipulation, we might not be able to prove that the original thefts from your company were the foundation for everything else. What do you need me to do? First, you need to stay safe. Your family believes they're still in control of the situation, which gives us an advantage. We want to keep it that way until we're ready to move. Detective Chen handed me a cell phone. This is a secure phone with my direct number programmed in. If your family contacts you or if you feel like you're in danger, call me immediately. Where am I supposed to go? I can't go home. We've arranged a safe house for you. It's a small apartment across town where you'll be under surveillance protection until we make the arrests. When will that happen? Soon. We're coordinating with federal agents because some of the fraud crossed state lines. We expect to have warrants within 48 hours. As Detective Chen gathered up the files, I realized that my old life was truly over. The house I had lived in for 38 years, the family I had loved and trusted, the identity I had built over 64 years, all of it had been stripped away in a single day. But for the first time since Sarah Morrison had handed me that napkin on the airplane, I felt something other than horror and betrayal. I felt the beginning of something that might eventually become peace. Detective, what will happen to the victims? The people who lost their money to David and Margaret? If we can recover any of the stolen assets, they'll be compensated through the court system. But I have to be honest with you, Mr. Hendricks, most of the money is probably gone. Your family has been very good at hiding and spending what they stole. I nodded, understanding that justice and restitution were two different things. I want to help in any way I can. These people trusted my family because they trusted me. I need to do whatever I can to make this right. Your testimony will be the most important evidence we have. Are you prepared for what that means? Your son and wife will go to prison for a very long time. Your family as you knew it will cease to exist. I thought about Margaret in the kitchen earlier, calmly discussing my murder as if she were planning a dinner party. I thought about David's cold calculation and complete lack of remorse. I thought about Captain Muller dying of a heart attack after losing his pension and his 73-year-old widow working at a grocery store. Detective, my family ceased to exist the moment I learned the truth about them. The people who are going to prison aren't my family. They're strangers who have been wearing my family's faces for 24 years. As she drove me to the safe house, Detective Chen asked one final question. Mr. Hendricks, do you have any regrets about walking away from your old life? I looked out the window at the city lights, thinking about the question. I regret that it took me so long to see the truth. I regret that I was so naive and trusting that I became a weapon they could use against innocent people. But walking away from that life? No, I don't regret that at all. What will you do when this is all over? For the first time in decades, I realized I had no idea what my future would look like. But instead of frightening me, the uncertainty felt like freedom. I suppose I'll find out who Clifford Hendricks really is when he's not being manipulated and controlled by people who never loved him. The safe house was a modest apartment in a building full of young professionals and college students. As I sat on the unfamiliar couch in the small living room, I realized that for the first time in my adult life, I was completely alone. No wife, no son, no family obligations or expectations. It should have been terrifying. Instead, it felt like coming home. The arrests happened on a Tuesday morning at 6:15. I watched from Detective Chen's unmarked car as federal agents and local police surrounded my house. Through the living room window, I could see Margaret in her pink bathrobe, gesturing frantically as officers read her rights. David arrived for what he thought was a breakfast meeting to finalize my commitment papers, walking straight into the arms of waiting agents. "How do you feel?" Detective Chen asked as we watched my wife and son being led away in handcuffs. "Empty," I said, and realized it was true. I had expected to feel satisfaction or vindication, but watching the people I had loved for decades being arrested felt like witnessing the death of everything I thought I knew about my life. The investigation that followed was more extensive than I had imagined. Federal agents seized computers, financial records, and filing cabinets full of evidence from both my house and David's office. The scope of their crimes expanded daily as more victims came forward, and investigators traced money through dozens of shell companies and fake accounts. Detective Chen called me 3 days after the arrests with an update that left me speechless. "Mr. Hendricks, we've identified 89 victims so far, and the total amount stolen is now estimated at over $15 million. $15 million. I sat down heavily in the small apartment's kitchen chair, trying to comprehend the magnitude of destruction my family had caused. There's more, Detective Chen continued. We found evidence that your son was planning to expand the operation internationally. He had been building relationships with fraud networks in Eastern Europe and South America. What does that mean? It means that if we hadn't stopped them when we did, the number of victims could have been in the thousands. Your family wasn't just running a local fraud scheme, Mr. Hendricks. They were building a criminal empire. The next few weeks passed in a blur of depositions, interviews, and court appearances. I spent hours with prosecutors going through every forged signature, every manipulated document, every conversation I could remember that had seemed innocent at the time, but now revealed itself as part of their elaborate deception. The hardest part was reading the victim impact statements. Elderly couples who had lost their homes. Widows who had been convinced to invest their life savings in David's fake retirement communities. Families who had borrowed money against their children's college funds to invest in Margaret's fraudulent recovery programs. One statement particularly haunted me. It was from Marie Patterson, an 82-year-old woman whose husband had died of cancer 3 years earlier. I trusted Mrs. Hendricks because she seemed so kind and understanding. She told me that her husband had been through the same financial struggles I was facing and that she knew exactly how to help me recover the money I had lost to another investment scam. I gave her the $47,000 I had saved for my granddaughter's wedding. It was all I had left in the world. Now I'm living in a one-room apartment above a pizza shop, and my granddaughter had to cancel her wedding because I can't help with the costs. Mrs. Hendricks didn't just steal my money, she stole my granddaughter's happiness and my family's respect for me. I read that statement 3 times before I had to put it down. Marie Patterson's granddaughter had lost her dream wedding because of my family's greed. The ripple effects of their crimes extended far beyond the immediate victims. Margaret and David were each charged with multiple counts of fraud, money laundering, elder abuse, and conspiracy. The prosecutors also filed charges for attempted murder in my case, based on the evidence of their plan to drug me into a fatal heart attack. I wasn't allowed to visit them in jail, but their lawyers contacted me several times, hoping I would provide character references or agree to plea negotiations. I declined every request. The people sitting in those jail cells weren't the family I had thought I knew. They were criminals who had spent decades perfecting their ability to manipulate and destroy lives. 6 weeks after the arrests, Detective Chen called with news that changed everything. Mr. Hendricks, we've recovered approximately $4.7 million in assets. Your son had been more careless about hiding money than we initially thought. What happens to that money? It will be distributed to the victims through the court system. It won't make everyone whole, but it will help some of the people who lost everything. How much will each victim receive? It depends on how much they lost and how much documentation they have, but we estimate that most victims will recover between 20 and 30% of their losses. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Marie Patterson might not be able to pay for her granddaughter's entire wedding, but she might be able to move out of that apartment above the pizza shop. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for October 15th. I arrived at the courthouse early, wearing the only suit I owned that hadn't been purchased with stolen money. As I walked up the courthouse steps, I saw a group of elderly people gathered near the entrance. They were the victims, many of them accompanied by adult children or caregivers. A woman in her 70s approached me as I reached the top of the steps. "Are you Clifford Hendricks?" "Yes." She studied my face for a moment, then nodded. "I'm Dorothy Walsh. Your son stole my husband's pension fund 6 months before he died. I just wanted to see what you looked like." I braced myself for anger, for accusations, for blame. Instead, Dorothy Walsh surprised me. "You look like a decent man," she said quietly. "I can see why people trusted you. I'm sorry your family used that against all of us." "Mrs. Walsh, I'm so sorry for what happened to you and your husband. If I had known—" "You would have stopped them. I believe that." She paused, looking at the courthouse entrance. "My daughter thinks I shouldn't have come today. She says it won't bring back the money and it won't ease the pain, but I needed to see justice being done. I needed to know that they wouldn't be able to hurt anyone else." Other victims approached me throughout the morning and their reactions varied. Some were angry, demanding to know how I could have been so blind for so long. Others were sympathetic, recognizing that I had been as much a victim of manipulation as they were. A few were simply curious, wanting to understand how someone could live with criminals for decades without realizing it. The hardest conversation was with Captain Muller's widow, Helen. She was a small, dignified woman in her 70s who walked with a cane and wore a dress that had clearly been expensive once, but was now carefully mended. "My husband never blamed you, Mr. Hendricks," she said. "Even after he figured out what your family had done, he said you were just another victim. Frank was good at reading people. He said you had honest eyes. Mrs. Muller, I wish I could bring your husband back. I wish I could undo all the damage my family caused." "You can't bring back the dead or reverse the past," she said simply, "but you can make sure the truth is told. That's what Frank would have wanted." Inside the courtroom, I sat in the witness section and watched as Margaret and David were led in wearing orange jumpsuits. They looked smaller somehow, diminished by their circumstances. Margaret's perfectly styled hair was now gray and unkempt. David's confident demeanor had been replaced by nervous glances around the room. When Margaret's eyes met mine across the courtroom, I saw something I had never seen before. Genuine fear. Not the calculated concern she had shown when discussing my mental decline, but raw terror at the prospect of spending her remaining years in prison. David didn't look at me at all. He kept his eyes focused on his lawyer, his jaw set in the stubborn expression I remembered from his childhood when he had been caught breaking rules. The prosecutor's opening statement laid out the scope of their crimes in stark detail. 89 victims, $15.2 million stolen, a conspiracy that had lasted 24 years. As the evidence was presented, I heard details that even Detective Chen hadn't shared with me. Margaret had convinced 3 different widows to take out life insurance policies, naming her as the beneficiary, then encouraged them to stop taking their heart medications. David had created fake medical research companies that promised experimental treatments for Alzheimer's and cancer, then pocketed the money desperate families had paid for non-existent cures. They hadn't just been thieves. They had been predators who fed on the desperation and vulnerability of elderly people facing their greatest fears: poverty, illness, and abandonment. During a recess, Margaret's lawyer approached me in the hallway. "Mr. Hendricks, my client, would like to speak with you." "I have nothing to say to your client. She wants to apologize. She wants you to know that she never meant for things to go this far." I looked at the lawyer, a young woman who probably believed she was representing someone who had simply made bad choices rather than a sociopathic predator. "Your client had 24 years to apologize. She chose instead to plan my murder. Tell her that the man she was married to doesn't exist anymore, and the man I am now has no interest in her apologies." The hearing continued for 3 days. Victim after victim testified about losing their life savings, their homes, their sense of security. Financial experts explained the complex web of shell companies and fake accounts David had created. FBI agents presented evidence of the international expansion plans that had been interrupted by the arrests. On the final day, I was called to testify about the forged signatures and the manipulation I had endured. As I walked to the witness stand, I passed the defendant's table. David finally looked at me, and for a moment I saw a flicker of the little boy I had taught to throw a baseball and helped with homework. Then he mouthed 2 words: "I'm sorry." I stopped walking and stared at him. After everything that had happened, after all, the evidence of his calculated cruelty, he was still trying to manipulate me with false remorse. I continued to the witness stand without acknowledging him. My testimony lasted 4 hours. I described decades of signing documents I hadn't read, trusting explanations that had been lies, believing in a family that had never existed. The defense lawyers tried to suggest that I had been willfully ignorant, that I must have suspected something was wrong. "Mr. Hendricks," David's lawyer said during cross-examination, "isn't it true that you wanted to believe your family was successful, even if it meant not asking difficult questions about where their money was coming from?" "No," I said firmly. "I believed my family was honest because I loved them and trusted them. The failure wasn't in my oversight. The failure was in their character. When the hearing ended, the judge set bail at $2 million each for Margaret and David. Neither could meet it, so they remained in jail while awaiting trial. As I left the courthouse, Dorothy Walsh approached me again. "Mr. Hendricks, some of us are getting together for coffee next week. Other victims, people who want to support each other through this process. Would you like to join us?" I thought about the invitation. A group of elderly people who had been destroyed by my family's greed, asking me to join them for coffee as if I were just another victim rather than the unwitting weapon that had been used against them. "Yes," I said. "I'd like that very much." Walking down the courthouse steps, I realized that something fundamental had changed in me during those 3 days of testimony. I was no longer the man who had been betrayed by his family. I was a man who had chosen to stand with the people his family had victimized. For the first time since this nightmare began, that felt like progress. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Margaret received 22 years in federal prison. David received 28 years. At 64 years old, I would likely never see either of them as free people again. I felt nothing as the verdicts were read. No satisfaction, no sadness, no sense of closure. Just a quiet acknowledgement that justice had been served, and that particular chapter of my life was finally over. What I didn't expect was how difficult it would be to figure out what came next. The safe house had been temporary, but when the trial ended, I realized I had nowhere to go. My house had been seized as evidence and would eventually be sold to compensate victims. Most of my possessions had been contaminated by association with my family's crimes, and I found I didn't want them anyway. At 64 years old, I was starting over with nothing but the small savings account I had maintained separately from the family finances and the Social Security benefits I had earned through 40 years of legitimate work. For the first time in my adult life, I was completely free to choose who I wanted to be. The coffee group Dorothy Walsh had mentioned became a weekly ritual. Every Thursday morning, 8 or 9 victims would gather at a small cafe downtown to share stories, offer support, and discuss the ongoing process of rebuilding their lives. At first, I felt like an intruder in their circle. These people had lost everything because of my family, and I worried that my presence would be a painful reminder of their trauma. But over the weeks, something unexpected happened. They began treating me not as the family member of their abusers, but as someone who understood what it felt like to have your entire world revealed as a lie. "You know," said Frank DeMarco, a retired teacher who had lost his pension to one of David's fake investment schemes. "In some ways, you were hurt worse than the rest of us. We lost money, but you lost your identity. You lost everything you thought you knew about yourself and the people you loved." Helen Muller, Captain Muller's widow, nodded in agreement. "Frank always said that the cruelest thing about fraud isn't the money that's stolen, it's the trust that's destroyed. You can earn money back, but learning to trust again, that takes real courage." These conversations helped me understand something important. I hadn't just been a victim of fraud. I had been a victim of emotional abuse that had lasted for decades. Margaret and David had systematically isolated me from reality, making me dependent on their version of truth while using my reputation and signature to destroy other people's lives. But sitting in that cafe every Thursday, listening to stories of resilience and recovery, I began to see something else. These people weren't just victims. They were survivors who had found ways to rebuild their lives, even after losing everything they thought they could count on. Marie Patterson, the 82-year-old woman whose granddaughter had lost her wedding fund, had started a small business making jewelry from recycled materials. "I figure if I'm going to start over at my age, I might as well try something I've always wanted to do," she said with a smile that reminded me of my own grandmother. Dorothy Walsh had begun volunteering at a legal aid clinic, helping other elderly people avoid the kinds of scams that had targeted our group. "I can't get my money back," she said, "but I can make sure other people don't go through what we went through." Their strength inspired me to think about what I wanted to do with whatever years I had left. I had spent my entire career in middle management following other people's directions and signing papers I didn't fully understand. Now, for the first time, I had the opportunity to make my own choices about how to spend my time and energy. The answer came to me during one of our Thursday coffee meetings when a new member joined our group. Robert Torres was a 70-year-old man whose wife had dementia and had been convinced to invest their life savings in one of Margaret's fake legal settlements. He arrived at the cafe looking lost and overwhelmed, clutching a folder full of legal documents he couldn't understand. "I don't know what to do," he said, tears in his eyes. "The lawyers are talking about power of attorney and asset protection, but I don't understand any of it. My wife was always the one who handled our finances. Now she can't remember what she had for breakfast, and I'm supposed to figure out how to rebuild our life savings at 70 years old." I looked at Robert's confused face and saw myself 6 months earlier, a man who had trusted other people to handle the important details of his life, only to discover that trust had been weaponized against him. "Robert," I said, "would you like me to help you go through those papers? I can't give you legal advice, but I can help you understand what the documents say and what questions you should ask your lawyer." That was the beginning of something I hadn't expected. Over the next few months, other members of our coffee group began asking for similar help. People who had been overwhelmed by the legal and financial complexities of fraud recovery found it easier to work with someone who had been through the same experience. I started spending my afternoons at the legal aid clinic where Dorothy volunteered, helping elderly fraud victims understand the paperwork involved in their cases. I learned to recognize the warning signs of financial abuse and the psychological tactics that scammers use to manipulate vulnerable people. The work was emotionally difficult, but deeply satisfying. For the first time in my life, I was using my experience to help people instead of unknowingly helping to hurt them. Every person I helped navigate the system was someone who might avoid the devastation that Margaret and David had caused to so many others. 6 months after the trial ended, Detective Chen called me with unexpected news. "Mr. Hendricks, we've recovered another $1.8 million in assets. Your son had hidden money in cryptocurrency accounts that took us months to trace." "How much does that bring the total recovery to?" $6.5 million. We're going to be able to compensate victims at about 45% of their losses instead of the 30% we originally estimated." The news meant that Marie Patterson would be able to help pay for her granddaughter's wedding after all. Robert Torres would have enough money to pay for his wife's care without losing their house. Helen Muller might be able to stop working at the grocery store and focus on her health. "There's something else," Detective Chen continued. "The federal prosecutors want to recognize your cooperation in the case. You're going to receive a commendation for your assistance in bringing your family to justice." "I don't need recognition for doing the right thing." "Maybe not. But the victims deserve to know that you stood with them instead of trying to protect your family. Sometimes acknowledgement matters as much as money when it comes to healing." A year after the arrests, our Thursday coffee group had grown to include 12 regular members and several volunteers from the legal aid clinic. We had become an informal support network for elderly fraud victims throughout the city, and several other cities had contacted us about starting similar groups. On a particularly warm Thursday in spring, I arrived at the cafe to find an unexpected visitor waiting for me. Sarah Morrison stood near the entrance, looking nervous but determined. "Mr. Hendricks, I hope it's okay that I came. I wanted to see how you were doing." "Sarah, of course it's okay. How's your mother?" "She's doing well. The chemotherapy is working and her doctors are optimistic." Sarah smiled, but I could see she had something more serious on her mind. "I also wanted to thank you." "Thank me for what?" "For proving that good people still exist. When Mom first told me about your family, I was so angry. I couldn't understand how you could have been married to someone so cruel for so long without knowing what she was really like." I nodded, remembering my own struggles with that same question. "But then I watched you testify at the trial," Sarah continued. "I saw how you chose to stand with the victims instead of making excuses for your family. I saw how you've spent the past year helping other people who went through what we went through, and I realized that the fact that you didn't see their evil doesn't make you stupid or weak, it makes you decent." Her words touched something deep inside me that I hadn't realized was still wounded. "Thank you, Sarah. That means more to me than you know. There's something else. Mom and I have been talking, and we'd like to invite you to dinner sometime. As a family friend, not as part of some business obligation, just because we care about you and we'd like you to know that you're not alone in the world." Standing outside that cafe, being invited to dinner by people who cared about me because of who I was rather than what I could provide for them, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades: genuine belonging. "I'd like that very much," I said. That evening, I sat in my small apartment, writing in a journal I had started keeping as part of my recovery process. I wrote about the day's conversations, about the progress our support group was making, about the satisfaction I felt when helping someone understand their legal options or recognize the warning signs of a scam. At the bottom of the page, I wrote something that surprised me. "Today I realized that losing my family was the best thing that ever happened to me. Not because I'm glad they're in prison, but because it forced me to discover who I really am when I'm not being manipulated and controlled by people who never loved me. I spent 64 years being the person other people wanted me to be. Now I get to spend whatever time I have left being myself." I closed the journal and looked around my small apartment. It wasn't much by conventional standards: one bedroom, a tiny kitchen, furniture from thrift stores, but it was mine in a way that the house I had shared with Margaret and David never was. Every choice in this space reflected my preferences, my values, my personality. On the wall hung a photograph from our support group's first anniversary gathering. 12 elderly faces smiling at the camera, people who had lost money but found friendship. People who had been betrayed but chose to trust again. People who had been victimized but refused to remain victims. I was in the center of the photograph, my arm around Helen Muller's shoulders, a genuine smile on my face. Looking at that picture, I realized something profound. This was my real family. Not the people who had shared my DNA or my name, but the people who had stood with me when everything fell apart and helped me build something better from the pieces. 3 years after that flight attendant slipped me a napkin that changed everything, I finally understood what freedom felt like. It wasn't the absence of responsibility or obligation, it was the presence of choice, the choice to help instead of harm, to build instead of destroy, to love people who deserved it instead of people who demanded it. I had spent most of my life being used as a weapon against innocent people. Now I was choosing to be a shield for people who needed protection. It wasn't the life I had planned, but it was the life I had chosen. And for the first time in 67 years, that felt like enough.